So on this very special edition of Downforce Meets, I've interviewed one author in the form of F1 Digital's very own Will Buxton, who's just recently published late last year My Greatest Defeat, a fantastic cornucopia of people that he's spoken to, including the late Andreas Niklas Niki Lauda, as we more commonly know him. Jon Saltinstall joins me. Jon, thank you very much for joining me here on Downforce Radio, the nation's motorsport station. Jon is the author of the newly released Niki Lauda, His Competition History. Now, for those that know about his Formula One statistics, here's a brief sort of count back. 171 Grand Prix starts, 25 wins, 24 pole positions, 24 fastest laps, and 3 World Championship titles, 2 of which were in 1975 and 1977 with Scuderia Ferrari, and then in 1984 with then Marlboro Team McLaren. Unfortunately, Niki passed away on May the 20th, 2019, at his family home with his family, including Matthias, one of his sons, in Zurich in Switzerland. But Niki had a bigger accomplishment. He completed a total of 316 races, starting from 1968. And Jon's 376-page book that has just been released, it's available from EVRO Publishing at just £60, first released in November 2019. Jon, thank you very much for joining me. Just tell us first of all about... This has been a labour of love for you. 9 years in the making from 2010. Quite a detailed diagnosis and recollection of Niki's efforts, starting in the famed Mini designed by Sir Alex Goldschmidt, of all people.
Indeed. Well, thank you for inviting me on. It's very kind of you. Thanks, Alex. 9 years, as you say. The genesis of the book was I've been a Lauda fan really since about 1973 when it first sort of crossed my radar by doing some extraordinary things in the BRM that shouldn't have been doing what it was doing. But having been a devout Lauda fan ever since then, I set out 9 years ago to write the book that I wanted to read because it didn't exist, and that involved really getting under the skin of a career that was quite well documented from his Formula One days, but he was much more than just a Formula One driver. He drove a very eclectic mix of cars, having started, as you say, in a Mini, hill climbing in Austria, progressing to racing on airfields in Porsche 911s and various other bits of machinery, then going through a career in a couple of years in Formula V, a highly unsuccessful year in Formula 3, a couple of years in Formula 2, which was where he just about started to make a mark. Before the career that most people would then know about him as a Formula One driver,
and which also, if memory serves me correct, he was one of the very own people that actually bought his own BMW M1 Pro car, and of all people that ended up engineering him was Ron Dennis, of all people.
Yes, indeed, and the Pro car story itself, you could write a book on, because BMW had actually subcontracted the manufacture of the cars out to various people. I think I was going to say Dallara, it might have been Lamborghini, was supposed to have been building a bunch of them, but didn't fulfil the orders, so they fell over themselves to get Ron Dennis's Pro Car Project 4 organisation to build them for them, and it was the money that Project 4 made from building the Pro Cars for the championship that was the cornerstone of what the first carbon fibre McLarens were able to be built with. I'd say that's a completely different story, but Niki had been approached by Ron to drive one of their cars for him. So he had a factory. He had a Pro Car entry in the Pro Car Project 4 entry in the Pro Car series, whereas everybody else was in either factory cars or other privately run ones. And they made a super job of it for him, enabling him to win that Pro Car championship. And that was the foundation of what later became his move to McLaren after his return from retirement.
Now, there's a couple of very special people that have known Niki throughout his years until his passing in May of last year. First one was the foreword, which was done by none other than Watty, John Watson, who was Niki's teammate at McLaren in 82 and 83, and actually substituted for Niki at the 1985 European Grand Prix in Brands Hatch due to an injury that Niki had sustained, and he currently commentates on the GT World Challenge Europe, well, formerly the Blancpain GT series, alongside David Addison. Now, John's been up until Niki's passing, John was a very, very good friend to Niki, and there was a bit of a rivalry, as there always is in Formula One when you're teammates, because that's the person you want to beat the most. But how did that all come about with putting the feelers out to John and saying, look, I'm doing this book very special, and I'd like for you to do the forward? How did the conversation with John go?
The connection with John came via EVRO, my publisher, who had worked with John on a previous project. Mark Hughes, who was the editorial director at EVRO, put me in touch with John. So we had a preliminary chat about what we wanted his forward to contain, and he basically said, well, let's have a chat. So we had a conversation for a couple of hours, and I think I asked him about 2 questions in that 2 hours, and he just basically downloaded, because he's a fantastic raconteur, as you know. Mm-hmm. And that conversation is pretty much the 3 or 4 pages of the forward that Waddy put in there. A very genial and affectionate recollection of his time with Niki. Mm. He did say that Bernie Eccleston had asked him before inviting or before signing a contract with Niki what he felt about having Niki as a teammate, and he kind of said, well, yeah, as long as I've got equal equipment, I don't mind. I'll race against anybody. But he later admitted that he hadn't anticipated just how politically adept Niki was at pulling the team together around him. Mm-hmm. And that was a lesson that he certainly took from him.
Indeed, and the afterword was done by Niki's initial mentor in single-seaters, which is Kurt Bergmann, also from Austria, who was known as Master, who's still ticking along, having recently celebrated his 90th birthday. He was the Cayman team boss who worked with Niki in the late 60s and early 70s, but also John, he mentored both Dieter Quester and one of the big pillars in Aston Martin Red Bull Racing's structure in terms of hierarchy, of course, Dr. Helmut Marko, who went on to win quite a few races in his own way. But to have such an iconic individual that has been a pillar of Austrian motorsport must have been nice for Kurt to give that sort of nice send-off for the book in a way, and sort of ending it on the right way possible, I feel.
Indeed, that was a stroke of good fortune in many ways. Whilst doing the research, I'd got in touch with a chap called Carl Holzinger, who races in historic Formula V over in Europe and largely curates the Cayman brand these days. And Carl is very close to Kurt Bergmann and had asked him some questions on my behalf as part of the research. Yeah. And through Carl, I approached Kurt and asked him originally if he would be prepared to write forward for the book. This was before we'd spoken to Watty. Mm-hmm. And Kurt came back with the article that you'd seen, and because of its poignancy and because of the way that it's written, we felt that it's an afterword rather than a forward. So we were very lucky to have that, and Kurt's been a delight throughout. Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a lot of key talking points within the book itself, John. Obviously, with the Cayman years in Formula V in '69, McNamara in '70, but then obviously having the debut with March at the Austrian Grand Prix in '71, but then obviously For those that don't know, Jon actually was following a career in banking whilst pursuing the interest of motorsport, which if I remember correctly, you won tickets to your first ever motor race at the age of 12 in a local newspaper competition because you grew up near Donington Park, of all places.
That's right, yeah. I grew up about 8 miles away from Donington, and the local newspaper had just run a competition for winning a couple of tickets to a Formula 2 race there. And I think it was probably the first guy who got the entry in won the tickets, and I was lucky enough to do that. Mm-hmm. I was already a motorsport fan from as long ago as I could remember, really. But having Donington just up the road, and particularly having the wonderful Donington collection just up the road was a fantastic experience.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Niki's been, Niki through his later years, famously was team principal at Jaguar for a couple of stormy seasons, but then along came the opportunity to join Toto Wolff at Mercedes-AMG Petronas, and he's been very instrumental, along with Ross Brawn, obviously securing the services of now 6-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton and the teams at Brackley and Brixworth. Really got to know Niki very, very well. And I think that in some respects was his way of giving back to the sport by helping, the Silver Arrows become the four in the modern age of Formula One. But I wanted to ask you one question, Jon. Out of all the moments that you've followed Niki, even past his racing career, which has, you've provided us such a fantastic encyclopedia Niki Lauda, I'll say here, which is pretty much what it is, because, ladies and gentlemen, you'll have to get the book to believe what I'm saying here. But out of all the moments out of Niki's racing career, particularly even him coming back after his near fatal accident of the Nordschleife back in 1976 when James Hunt won the title, what is your favourite moment of Niki, whether it be behind the wheel? I know this is like saying, this is like asking me to choose between my children here, but
which is your favourite child?
Exactly, but if you want to give me your top 3 moments that first come into your mind about Niki as a character, but also as a racer.
Things that define him as a person.
Yeah,
I guess not in any particular order, but the fact that he was quite comfortable in breaking off relations with his grandfather after his grandfather had vetoed the bank loan that would have got him into his Formula 2 seat back in 1971, and never spoke to him again because that was the kind of decisive and brusque individual that Niki was as a young man. He's come back from the Nürburgring shunt. He's probably bar none the greatest sporting comeback in any discipline.
Yes,
and he's probably the defining characteristic that most people in the world would think of when they think of Niki. But probably the defining thing for him as a man, and it's picked up probably to some extent in My Greatest Defeat that you referred to earlier.
Exactly.
After the loss of the Lauda Air flight over Thailand, when it was held by Boeing, or it was certainly maintained by Boeing at the time, that it had been operator error rather than aircraft error, and he pursued them for years through various. It took him about 4 years to prove that it was a mechanical failure and have the families compensated. But the story that came out of that many years later was that in the immediate days following the accident, after visiting the crash site, Niki sat alone at a table in a hotel reception in Kuala Lumpur with no PR, with no lawyers, completely alone, and spoke to every family who had lost a family member on that flight, which not only shows what an intensely human and caring person he was, but what a brave man, because at that moment everybody thought it was his fault. So possibly even braver than the comeback. He would say that was the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life, but certainly an incredibly brave and human man.
Yes, definitely. I think that is one of the... It showed that behind the machine, with that famous, iconic red race helmet that we saw over many years in Formula One, to define him as a man behind the machine, and was really just... when I spoke with Will about this on a previous edition of Downforce Meets, which you can listen to on our Spreaker network, it is definitely a defining characteristic that I think a lot of people seem to not sweep under the carpet, I would say, John, but probably push a little bit to the wayside. But yeah, I think Martin Brundle also echoed your comments there as well, with Sky Sports saying it was the greatest sporting comeback, 6 weeks, and he goes back onto Italian soil and manages to get himself together and battle the fears, the demons that were raging inside his mind to finish fourth, because everyone didn't concentrate on the leader. They were just thinking, where's Niki going to finish?
Indeed. And at a time when his teammate Regazzoni was more popular in Italy, to hear the Tifosi chanting Lauda after that race was spine-tingling.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, go on, keep going.
No, I was sorry, I was just cutting across you then. I was just going to say that it's worth remembering that in the Japanese Grand Prix that year, when he famously said, "I'm not doing this, my life is worth more than the World Championship," and was vilified in the Italian press for it, because of course you have to remember he wasn't just retiring Niki Lauda from that race, he was retiring Ferrari from the race, and that is, that was a major factor, and it was only years later that it was disclosed that he wasn't able to drive in those monsoon conditions because as a result of his burned eyelids, he couldn't blink. So if you're driving blind in monsoon conditions, you're a danger to other people as well as yourself. Never ever use that as an excuse. Never ever claim that was the reason why he quit, but actually it was.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, thank you very much for your time. Jon Saltinstall, from the author of Niki Lauda, His Competition History. John, thank you very much for your time. Really do appreciate it, and thank you very much for providing us with such a bit more of an open door onto Niki's racing history.
It's a pleasure, thank you, Alex, and I appreciate you inviting me on.
No problem at all. So don't forget, you can get Niki Lauda, His Competition History, with the author Jon Saltinstall, from EVRO Publishing. You can get it on their official website. You can also go to Amazon as well. Priced at £60, 376 pages of what I think is a fantastic swan song to the life and times and the racing career of Niki Lauda. Don't forget, tune in next time for our next Downforce Meets. This was Downforce Meets with Jon Saltinstall, presented by Alex Goldschmidt. Produced by Florian Schmeis. This has been a high-speed Autobahn production for Downforce Radio, the nation's motorsport station. Thank you for listening to Downforce Meets, and we'll see you next time.